Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you
hey,
are
Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly? Are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Sure. I just wanted to welcome everyone again to UT's Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Neuberger. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a historian of Bulgaria and Southeastern Europe in general. I am also the director of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the chair of our Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And for all of you who are in Austin and Central Texas, if you didn't hear me before, we have in the forecast egg-sized hail today. So batten down the hatches and hide your cars.
Thank you very
Children
much.
and pets.
You've been
Keep them
warned.
inside.
You've been
Okay,
warned.
now I'll pass it off to you, Kirill.
Thank you very much. Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and also part of the Center for East European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I have a particular pleasure, and I'm very, very excited because the presentation will be delivered by a dear friend and a colleague of mine from our department and his research assistant. And today we're having a very, very interesting topic, which is titled The Iron Guard Ecclesiology of Nae Ionescu and Mircea Eliade. And it will be presented by Dr. Jason Roberts and Sergio Glăjar. And formally, I would like to introduce to our audience the speakers for today. Dr. Jason Roberts holds a joint appointment in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the Department of Religious Studies. He has completed his PhD in an ad hoc program in UT's Department of Germanic Studies and a PhD portfolio in Religious Studies. He also holds an MA in Slavic Languages and Literature from UT Austin and an MM in Piano Performance from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Now, his interests, which are very wide and very interesting, focus on theology as intellectual history and the impact on historical meta-narratives in the social sciences. His current research examines confessional changes in the concepts of purity and authority within the context of Christian exorcism and magic from the 1st through 16th century. Other areas of interest include Siberian shamanism, representations of space and time in systems of divination and ritual theory. I hope I didn't get anything wrong here, Dr. Roberts. His co-presenter is Sergio Glăjar Esquire in his graduate of Emory Law and is presently Dr. Roberts' ESPRI, and I will say in a second what ESPRI stands for, research assistant. And he's preparing his first translation, with very interesting, of Nae Ionescu's Philosophia Religiae. Dr. Roberts is also director of the initiative, the Study of Political Religious Ideation and Influence, which is an organization under University of Texas Austin's CREASE, and focuses on analyzing the digital footprint, media activity, and actions, direct or indirect, of those seeking to influence political, economic, and social narrative in Europe, Eurasia and Russia within their respective common interest social networks and beyond. This is a very interesting initiative, and I know a lot of the present people in the auditorium today are students and are involved. And without further ado, Dr. Roberts, I've been waiting for a long time for this day to look at this very interesting presentation. The floor is yours. The pleasure is all ours.
Thank you so very much. I hope to answer a lot of questions about why an intellectual historian of theology is working on this with the presentation. So I won't start with that now. We'll get right into it because I do have a lot to share. I will say, largely, the answer to that question is that it's Kirill's fault. He took an innocent religious studies reformationist and turned him slowly towards political science. But to my disappointment, if not surprise, fascism has a lot in common with certain kinds of theology, as I hope to explain over the course of the presentation. So welcome, friends and colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Avramov, Dr. Neuberger, for the invitation. And a special thank you to Sergio Glăjar, who has been an amazing research assistant and who has been a tirelessly enthusiastic interlocutor through the project. So now I'm going to try very hard to share screens in such a way that will allow me to do this. Okay, and now presenter view, drag. I practiced, can you tell? All right.
Fantastic. It looks really great.
Okay.
Rock and roll.
So away we go. This presentation seeks, in the first place, to intervene into the debate about the problematic nature of Mircea Eliade's theory of religion. Those of you who are familiar with religious studies will know the name. Many of you who are not will know the name. We'll get more into that in just a moment. However, the presentation has further implications, which I will discuss at the end of the presentation. It is the first public appearance of what will ultimately become a book. I should make clear that I'm not a Balkanist, although I apparently play one on Zoom, and not a political scientist. I'm an intellectual historian of largely Western Christian theology and came to the project through an examination of the apocalyptic eschatology of Dugin's fourth political theory. I'm looking at Dugin's fourth political theory as theology, and spoiler, it is. I noticed that both Dugin's argument, was ecclesiological, pertaining to the formation of some notion of a church, and that Dugin was drawing heavily on the ideas of Mircea Eliade. And here we have our hypothesis, our thesis. Eliade's theories privilege modes of religiosity which satisfy Roger Griffin's minimal definition of fascism. Thus, his theory reveals that the most authentic and valid form of society is religious fascism. It just sort of happens to be that fascists got it right, although he doesn't come out and say that directly, it's indirectly. It should be said that Eliade's theory of religion also satisfies other definitions of fascism, such as Umberto Eco's Ur-fascism definition, and definitions of nationalism, such as Fox and Miller Idris's model of talking, choosing, performing, and consuming the nation. And here we have Eliade, who is one of the most influential scholars of religion in the 20th century, and one of the world's foremost interpreters of religious symbolism and myth. His theories continue to have broad currency in popular and New Age religious writing, as well as, unfortunately, in far-right philosophy, as we'll see in a moment. He was also the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Chicago, which gave him a platform from which to speak. I've included this slide to highlight just part of the continued relevance of Eliade's theory of religion and the importance of our deeper understanding of it. If, as I will argue, his theory represents a kind of fascist philosophy or theology and not merely an outdated approach to religious studies, then the incorporation of his ideas into the intellectual works, particularly the philosophical works of others, like those on the slide, takes on a deeper significance. Here we have Julius Evola, the Italian self-styled ultra-fascist philosopher and traditionalist writer, Alain de Benoit, the foremost exponent of the European New Right, Alexander Dugin, the Russian Eurasianist ideologue who is a neo-traditionalist and draws heavily from Evola, and Dr. Jordan Peterson, whom we'll return to, of his 12 rules and 12 more rules fame. The first two knew Eliade directly, interacted with him personally and professionally, and the latter two have drawn heavily on Eliade's theory for their work. Names could be added to this list, including Dominique Venner and Jason Reza Georgiani, for those of you who are familiar with him. He's a far-right philosopher along the lines of Dugin, etc. The controversy surrounding Eliade's theory of religion isn't resolved. Even as it may be agreed that he has largely fallen out of favor, the reason for his unpopularity remains significant. On the left, you see three major critiques of his scholarship: the phenomenological critique, the ideological, and the ontological. I would argue that most scholars who have abandoned Eliade have done so for reasons pertaining to the phenomenological critique. As a scholar of religions Robert Baird recognized in 1971, quote, Eliade's methodology is not historically falsifiable. Since it is an ahistorical approach, however legitimate that may be in itself, we have our red flag for phenomenology, when it comes into historical deliberation, it becomes a barrier to the attainment of authentic religio-historical understanding. For Baird, then, the issue with Eliade's theory is its applicability to a given type of scholarship, not an inherent problem. Ahistorical theory could be useful for studying ahistorical things, phenomena. He writes, an issue that needs to be brought out is whether knowledge of religious phenomena, like knowledge of all human phenomena, proceeds through inductive, data-bound studies or through a deductive, paradigm-bound approach. I point this out because if Eliade has merely fallen out of favor because of his theories represent this phenomenological approach, then he doesn't answer for the other weightier criticisms of fascist ideology and crypto-theology. In other words, not phenomenological, but rather ideological and ontological approaches. My study, unique to the best of my knowledge, takes the ontological critique that Eliade's theory represents a kind of crypto-theology at face value and proceeds to analyze what kind of theology it is. The benefit of this approach is that it proposes to address the relevance of Eliade's personal ideological bias to his theory of religion. In simple terms, I answer the question, does it matter if Eliade was a fascist, with the question, does Eliade's theory of religion amount to fascist theology? The project rests on two concomitant theses, which both must be proven. First, if Eliade's theory isn't somehow fascist itself, then there's no further issue, although such a conclusion would fail to account for his popularity with past and present far-right philosophers like those already mentioned. If it is fascist, but merely descriptive, then Eliade is only guilty of describing fascism in religion, which, by the way, is no more than I'm doing right now. He might be wrong to conclude that authentic religion is necessarily fascist, but he wouldn't therefore also be guilty of encouraging religious fascism by way of analogy, both gasoline and a match. So I turn you over temporarily to Sergio for some discussion about the relationship between Eliade and his mentor, Nae Ionescu.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. If we can just go to the next slide.
Yes.
All right, so here's our take on a popular, perhaps once popular meme. It has here Mircea Eliade on the left, Nae Ionescu on the right. Obviously, Eliade just asking him if I can copy your homework. So this ties into what Dr. Roberts just said as our demonstration of each of the 2 points Dr. Roberts just mentioned. So some inherent fascism in the theory and a prescriptive intent. These proceed from a comparison to the philosophy of religion of Eliade's friend and mentor, Nae Ionescu, who was one of the chief ideologues of the fascist Romanian Guard. Ionescu's philosophy, which has received little attention in the Eliade debate overall, is both demonstrably fascist and demonstrably prescriptive. We argue that Eliade must have known what he was doing because he has effectively recreated Ionescu's Iron Guard ideology as his own theory of religion. So this meme is just included here to underscore precisely that the operative elements of Eliade's theory are in fact identical to the operative elements of Ionescu's own theory of religion. So turning to the next slide. These are our major works. On the left two are by Nae Ionescu, the right two are by Mircea Eliade. So we have Philosophia Religiae, which was a course that he gave in 1925 that's since been lithographed. Then we have Phenomenological, which we will talk about later. The dates for these books, the left-hand date is the day that it was, or the year that it was originally presented, either as a course in university or as a prison lecture. And then the right-hand two are our Eliade main texts. So we got the sacred and the profane, and we've got the myth of the eternal return. The dates on these, left-hand date is the original French publication, and then the right-hand date is its subsequent English translation. So Ionescu's philosophy and then his legionary ideology are laid out in Philosophia Religiae and Phenomenological together. What's important about the Eliade books is that Eliade's representation of Ionescu's theory or ideology, while discernible in his entire output, is most evident in these two. In fact, Myth of the Eternal Return is a book that Eliade considered to be his quintessential work, and it appeared 11 years after Ionescu's Phenomenological. So, Myth of the Eternal Return, together with the sacred and the profane, these represent Eliade's most thorough and explicit recapitulation of Ionescu's own philosophy of religion, Philosophia Religiae. Moving on to the next slide, if you will, Dr. Roberts, thank you. So I'm just going to read this line first. Actually, the line comes from a 1937 collection of Nae Ionescu's articles, which Eliade himself took it upon himself to collect, edit, and publish. And he published it as Rosa Vânturilor, which means the compass rose. So I'm going to read this quote now. It says, this is by Eliade in his postface, in his sycophantic postface to Rosa Vânturilor. It says, the presence of Nae Ionescu was and continues to be so overwhelming that his name has stretched out over the country, transfigured by myth or bloodied by the magnificent venom of hatred. Everywhere that Nae Ionescu is spoken of, the legend or hatred is present. Yet both the one and the other reveal, with the same abundance, the strength of the story of this man who for 15 years has been prefacing and building a country. So this is what Eliade had to say about Nae Ionescu. Worth noting here briefly is that all but two of the articles that Eliade included in Rosa Vânturilor had previously been published by Nae Ionescu in the newspaper Cuvântul from the years 1926 to 1933. Now, also important to note is that Ionescu was the editor of Cuvântul, and Eliade was at times his co-editor, but either way closely collaborated with Ionescu in the paper and wrote a great number of articles for it himself. Eliade's sections of, so the sections that Eliade picks for Ionescu's writings in Rosa Vânturilor, these actually represent the monarchist period of the journal's leadings. Indeed, Cuvântul, whose name is actually a religious reference to logos, or the word, meaning the word literally in Romanian, the Cuvântul began actually supporting explicitly Codreanu and the Legion, the Iron Guard, in November of 1933. We can go to the next slide, please, Dr. Roberts. Okay, this quote is actually from this 1938 Phenomenological, or the Legionary phenomenon in English, and I'm just going to read along. I have a duty towards God only in my nation, or as the nation is the most important collective circle that man lives in history, I have not but a single tribute to pay in life, in the face of God, through the nation. If God is not only my God, if he is not a singular God, but is also the God of the Hungarians, the French, etc., then I would no longer be Romanian, and I would no longer be able to pay my tribute to God through my nation. So as we can glean from this quote here, the legionary phenomenon is the most concise presentation of Ionescu's ideas. Indeed, the points towards which he builds gradually over the course of a semester in his 1925 course on the philosophy of religion that we mentioned earlier, all of these are presented much more directly in Phenomenological. So, excuse me, again, over the course of this presentation, we seek to demonstrate that the operative elements of Ionescu's philosophy of religion, this 1925 course, also known as trairism, which Dr. Roberts will touch on in a moment. These became an integral part of legionary ideology, and the Ionescu elements are identical to the operative elements of Eliade's theory of religion. Thus, this constitutes the basis in our study. Next slide, please, Dr. Roberts. All right, here we just have a timeline of some relevant dates. So earlier than 1919, I'll start there. In 1913, Nae Ionescu leaves Romania to pursue a doctorate in Germany at the University of Munich, where, interestingly, he also apparently briefly worked with Edmund Husserl. Shortly after completing this PhD in 1919, he secured a position as an assistant professor to the famous Professor Radulescu Motru at the University of Bucharest. In 1924, we see that the Communist Party of Romania was banned, and indeed, it was the following year that Ionescu delivered his anti-rational, anti-historical, and thus anti-Marxist philosophy of religion. That same year, Mircea Eliade also becomes a student at the University of Bucharest, and the relationship between the two men begins to blossom almost immediately. 1927 is a sad day in the history of Romania. This is the year that Corneliu Zelea Codreanu establishes the Legion of the Archangel St. Michael, came to be known as the Iron Guard. Moving to our next date then, in 1938, in May of 1938, Nae Ionescu and a number of legionaries are all arrested and sent into forced domicile in the town of Miercurea Ciuc, which is notoriously one of the coldest cities in Romania, and where Ionescu would deliver the 4 conferences that are known today and that we've already mentioned, phenomenological, the legionary phenomenon. So these are essentially prison lectures. And as a matter of fact, Eliade would join Ionescu and the others in Miercurea Ciuc the following month. So the same year, 1938, King Carol II, he declares a royal dictatorship in Romania, and Codreanu himself is killed in November of 1938. So all of the meanwhile, as a professor, as a journalist, and as a significant political figure, Nae Ionescu amassed quite a number of so-called disciples from the also so-called young generation of Romania, including most notably these names we have here on the right. So we've got Eliade, of course, we have Emil Cioran, Mircea Vulcănescu, Constantin Noica, Mihail Sebastian, and Eugen Ionescu. Now, important to note is that the last 2 names there, Sebastian and Ionescu, these were students of Ionescu's, but they actually largely resisted this kind of influence, political, religious influence from him, and they emerged as decidedly non-fascist. Mihail Sebastian, of course, having been the famous Romanian Jewish novelist, and Eugen Ionescu, the famous playwright. I believe Rhinoceros is his biggest one. So I'd actually like to share with you a quote that Eugen Ionescu, not to be confused with Ionescu, penned in 1945. It says here, so Ionescu, our proud young generation from 15 and 10 years ago has decomposed and disappeared. None of us are even 40 years old yet, and we're finished. Others, so many, dead. We were depraved. Insofar as it has to do with me, I cannot reproach myself that I was a fascist. Cioran is here, exiled. He admits he erred in his youth. It is difficult for me to forgive him. For Mircea Eliade, everything is lost, and for some time. He is very guilty. But Eliade and Cioran, and the imbecile Noica, and the fat Vulcănescu, and so many others, are the victims of the odious and defunct Nae Ionescu. Were it not for Nae Ionescu, we would have had today a valorous generation of leaders in between 35 and 40 years old. Because of him, they all became fascists. So Eugen Ionescu in 1945. Critical to note here is that only 4 years after Ionescu writes this, in the immediate post-war period, Eliade publishes his Myth of the Eternal Return, which, as we argue, is nothing other than his version of Ionescu's philosophy of religion. Thus, we suggest that Eliade was perhaps not as repentant, or not repentant at all, in the way that some of his apologists have since suggested. So next slide, Dr. Roberts, please. Thank you. Here we're turning to actual Iron Guard ecclesiology as a third model of fascism. So first, the picture here, the man in the hat and the peasant attire is Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. We see him essentially surveying his troops, obviously all delivering the Sieg Heil. We should note that Codreanu here is dressed in traditional peasant Romanian garb, which was part of the, I'd say, the aesthetic maybe of the Iron Guard. But what's important here is this quote. This is from Nae Ionescu, and it's from his Legionary phenomenon. It says, pretty simply, with us, the Orthodox, the nation, and the church are superimposed. For the individual, then, in history, the nation is unabsolute. So the superimposition of church and nation reflected in this quote, along with the superimposition of church and race, which Ionescu would make elsewhere, these have led us to theorize Iron Guard fascism in theological, specifically ecclesiological terms. All right, so with this brief introduction to Iron Guard ecclesiology, I now turn our presentation back over to the esteemed Dr. Roberts. Dr. Roberts?
Thank you, Sergio. So, in order to demonstrate the fascist characteristics of Ionescu's philosophy of religion, and then by comparison of Eliade's theory of religion, I've begun with Roger Griffin's minimal definition of palingenetic myth, which is the myth of national rebirth, plus ultra-nationalism. Additionally, Raul Costocia's chapter, hi Raul, on Iron Guard inspired me to bring in Fox and Miller Idris's model as well. Yet I have a problem with both definitions, as I believe does Raul. Both models seem to assume the pre-existence of a concept of nation and thus obscure the possibility of an emergent or competing idea of nation in a myth of national rebirth or in the performance of nationalism. Theology, on the other hand, is well suited to defining or redefining community in terms of belief and action, because it explicitly involves the concept of revelation. Theology, and more specifically ecclesiology, which is to say the formation of an ecclesia, which is church, but not church in the institutional, physical, mundane sense, but in the spiritual, transcendent sense, is the battlefield on which every schism and reformation is fought, and it is within such a framework that any given new truth is revealed. In mapping Griffin's definition of fascism, as well as Fox and Miller Idris's model of nationalism onto this theological model, none of their specificity is lost. Rather, the possibility of comparing the introduction or emergence of novel or competing concepts of nation is merely added. Oh, there we go. The formation of an ecclesia begins with the revelation of the nature of the authentic individual. So what is revealed is not the church itself, the church in heaven, the Platonic form of the church, but rather the perfect church member, which implies the church. What such a person must hold to be true and to be false, and what such a person knows to be good and to be evil. Once again, the framework for discussing this revelation, which is integral to ecclesiology, is what I believe to be somewhat obscured in the models of fascism and nationalism previously mentioned. Yet in his philosophy of religion, Ionescu could scarcely be clearer in demonstrating the revelation of a new ecclesia, nation. He begins by questioning the individual's relationship to a group identity. He writes, "But what does spiritual structure, ecclesia, mean in actual existence? If, for example, we have in our consciousness that we are Christians, in this everyday affirmation, I am Christian, Christian Orthodox, does that mean that I am a Christian?" He's juxtaposing the true spiritual form with the familiar mundane form and separating them. Thus, the Christian identity that Ionescu proposes exists independent of the individual, independent of every individual, and is revealed as a possibility. As we will see, the individual must choose and strive to assume the identity. This is the function of theodicy, the problem of evil, and of soteriology, the matter of salvation. In an example of his theodicy, Ionescu warns of the danger of the other, He writes, if, for example, I say that I am Romanian, and in a given day I come to you with a scientific system of philosophy, you would have the right to be suspicious. If you know at least a little about the spiritual structure of Romanians, you will know that science and the scientific spirit have nothing to do with this spiritual structure. Sergio and I had a nice giggle at that. With regard to Ionescu's soteriology, salvation, the striving to participate, to have, he writes, to have a specific religious life, in other words, to belong to the ecclesia, means to live this specific religious life even unconsciously. That is, Christian is he who lives in the religious life, which, as spiritual structure, superimposes itself with the ethos of the Christian nation, or the Christian religion. And non-Christian, the formation of the other, is he who does not have this superimposable spiritual structure. That is, he who fails to participate in the transcendent reality, who does not know in his domain of spirituality the congruity. That is, the historical element exists, but the historical element does not confuse itself with that which we think about. Rather, the historical element is a thing in itself, which we can come to know or not, end quote. In other words, it is not enough to act like one believes. This should be familiar to some people. One must actually believe. For while the historical material church is congruous with the spiritual reality, they are not one and the same, and it is the latter which defines authenticity, nation in this ecclesio-fascist sense. Ionescu continues, it is obvious that when someone who says that they are Romanian wants to expound to you a system of philosophy, you must heighten your suspicions, and you must think that they are outside influences, which have not yet been put through the rocks of the mind, it's a Romanian expression, to pick what is good and what is bad, which is soteriology and theodicy. In other words, the soteriological task of the individual who would belong is not merely to accept the good, but to reject the bad. Thus, he arrives at his definition of ecclesia. So it also is that with the historical element in the religious life, so it also is with the historical element in the religious life. There exists a religiosity particular to each religion. That is, there exists a religiosity particular to each history, and no one, properly said, has the right to transgress this domain. In other words, Hungarians cannot be Orthodox and Romanians cannot be Catholic. Yet perhaps more to the point, Romanians must be Orthodox, a matter of no small historical importance in light of the large Uniate or Romanian Catholic population that still existed during the interwar period. For Ionescu, then, identity on the level of ecclesia is a transcendental reality, one that requires revelation, which is concomitant with what he calls historical realities, such as race and state. Race and state are not sufficiently real in and of themselves. In other words, to be an ethnic Romanian and a citizen of the Romanian state is not enough to make you a real Romanian. For that, you must partake in the transcendental reality, which I'm calling the ecclesia. Now, near the end of Philosophia Religiae, his philosophy of religion, Ionescu writes, race, properly said, is only a manner of speaking. I do not know exactly what race is. When I say this word, I want to understand all of the contingent elements of history, of time and space, that determine in a given moment a spiritual structure, an ecclesia. The spiritual structure to which Ionescu refers is that same one which he superimposed over nation in the quote that Sergio shared with you. He writes elsewhere, a historical form is an organic unity. For example, I cannot be orthodox if I am capitalist, idealist, or nominalist in philosophy, individualist in ethics, democrat in politics. If I am Protestant, I can be no other way. Each historical moment represents a historical form, which is obligatory for those who participate in it. And here we have the moral imperative, the obligatory to participate. The point of this ecclesiological fascism, if we can call it that, is thus not that it isn't racial or nationalist, rather that race and state alone are not enough to merit salvation, that salvation which is afforded to belonging to this fascist ecclesia. The obligatory participation is crucial to the formation of ecclesia. Ionescu begins with his religious man. His argument starts, so we're all Orthodox Christians here. He begins with this as a fact. Romanians are Orthodox. He then proceeds to his theory of the religious act, which serves as the substantiation of the validity of revelation, and spends quite a bit of time on this. It serves as both his ontological proof and the basis of his usurpation of religion as identity. He is suggesting an emergent and competing notion of nationalism. He is not the first fascist to the game. Yes, he accomplishes this by explaining what is wrong with the way that most people are doing religion. From there, he moves to how people would think and act if they were doing religion correctly. Finally, he returns to a portrait of the religious man with the crucial differences that the religious identity is now, first, different than it was at the beginning, second, conscious, and third, shared with others in a new ecclesia. Both Eliade and Ionescu, there we go, make circular ecclesiological arguments. They assume their conclusion as their point of departure. Moreover, they're virtually the same argument. The difference is that Eliade's is made in abstract terms, and Ionescu's is made in concrete terms. So Eliade's is one did, and Ionescu's is Romanians must. Eliade begins with the ideal beliefs and arrives at the ideal community by way of the individual who holds the beliefs. Ionescu begins with the ideal individual and arrives at the ideal community by way of the necessary beliefs. I will not pause here to explain this slide because that explanation comprises the rest of the presentation. The slide merely serves as a graphic representation of our point-for-point comparison of their ideologies. So, in another sort of cheeky meme version as a reading heuristic, Ionescu's religious man, om religios. This is Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. He only recognizes Romanian Orthodox as real. Literally says others do not exist. Ionescu does. He conquers new territory in the name of God and race. He abolishes the terror of history with spiritual forms, which is to say by realizing and expanding ecclesia. He is authentic. This is the revelation and the ecclesiology. Be like him, the theodicy and the soteriology, the concrete presentation of the theory. Now we have the abstract presentation of the same theory, which those of you who are familiar with Eliade will probably recognize. Eliade's homo religiosus. He's only translated Ionescu's term into Latin, from om religios into homo religiosus. And Eliade gets credit for coining the use of the term homo religiosus. This is archaic or traditional man in the abstract. He only recognizes archetypes as real, turns chaos into cosmos by sacralizing it, and banishes the terror of history with sacred time. He's authentic, revelation and ecclesiology. Be like him, theodicy and soteriology. All right. So now we will go through brief presentation of evidence of the parallels from their writing. Ionescu's religious act and Eliade's hierophanies refer to the same process-product relationship. In other words, the religious act produces hierophanies, revelations. For Ionescu, the content of such revelation is spiritual forms. For Eliade, it's archetypes. In both cases, the content of the revelation is the nature of good and evil, which inform the moral imperative of homo religiosus. In political terms, the revelation defines us and them. As deficits and excesses, the good and the evil separate the individual from happiness, however defined. Thus, ecclesia, the nation, is already implied by the moral imperative of the individual who wishes to be saved, to become. It is the potential community of the like-minded. In a given moment, Ionescu writes, there appears in this world a philosopher who, instead of being rationalist and idealist, is a realist and a mystic. He's modestly referring to himself, by the way. He acquires a kind of fame, adepts, a school. His concept does not fit in organically with the historical reality that it represents. If he and the school disappear after a few years, the crisis was passing. If he wins adherents from different sectors of life, and if there exists a tendency towards correlation, it means we are dealing with a new historical form. He's spitting in the eye of Hegel. He's suggesting that the new historical form, the new material form, and of Marx and of Stalin, as it turns out, does not arise dialectically, but just sort of happens, and then it is either embraced, which is the soteriology, if you like this idea, breathe it into being, or not. No salvation for you. For both Ionescu's religious man and Eliade's homo religiosus, the soteriological task, the means of salvation, is to realize these spiritual forms or archetypes in history. Ionescu describes this as a process of bringing the forms about, whereas Eliade describes it as a process of abolishing every historical form that does not have a spiritual, transcendental, archetypal correspondent. All right. I've included this slide to underscore Ionescu's and Eliade's extensive engagements with ontological arguments of various Western theologians. So the revelation part of the theological model of fascism is crucial. For example, I would argue later that Jordan Peterson is using evolution in this way as a sort of revelatory mythos, and Dugin is combining Eurasianism with Heideggerian philosophy to sort of call into being a legitimacy of his claim. Not unlike the theologians they cite, both of them strive to ground their revelation in an ontological proof of God or the sacred. The resulting proof of transcendent reality has two main functions. First, it provides the legitimation, as I just mentioned, for the revelation of the individual's excesses and deficits, which is to say, the things that are wrong with you and the things that are right with you. And second, it falsifies counterclaims, namely Protestantism, Catholicism, capitalism, and Marxism. Okay. Both Ionescu and Eliade employ the same elaborate ontological argument for the existence of God or the sacred. The experience of God or the sacred reveals to the individual the possibility of authenticity or balance, etc., as the transcendent but objective mode of existence in which the individual can potentially participate by achieving their soteriological tasks. Those who achieve, or at least take striving for it as their objective, form the ecclesia by virtue of their choice to participate. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain the ontological argument to you because those always take a while to explain, and this one is particularly counterintuitive. Nevertheless, this ontological proof, which appears in both of their theories or ideologies, constitutes some of the most damning evidence regarding Eliade's repackaging of Ionescu's legionary ideology as his own theory of religion, for the reason that it is based on an early 15th century ontological proof of German Catholic theologian Nicholas of Cusa, and is called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. As Ionescu's assistant, Eliade lectured on, among other things, Aristotle's metaphysics and Nicholas of Cusa's De Docta Ignorantia, which is the text in which Nicholas of Cusa expounds his coincidentia oppositorum. That, and Eliade used the term and wrote an entire book on it. Not only are we absolutely certain that both are drawing on Cusa, but we can also demonstrate that they are both misusing coincidentia oppositorum in the same way. The significance of this fact is fascinating in its own right, perhaps another talk another day, but it's not necessary for the present conversation. On to theodicy, the problem of evil and the revelation of evil. In other words, who are the bad guys? In the broadest sense, theodicy refers to the vindication of divine goodness and providence in view of the existence of evil. It's the general theological definition. However, a definition that broad is not necessary here because both Eliade and Ionescu take a narrow view of evil. For both Ionescu and Eliade, theodicy has the same more particular function of defining evil not merely as something to be denied or even resisted, but rather as something to be actively conquered. It defines them in an us versus them dichotomy. For example, I'll read just the blue. If there exists a decrease of religiosity, that is to say, the desacralization of the world, that is, if this misery exists for mankind, if mankind can no longer live quietly in all of its plenitude with the relationship with the absolute, it is because the religiosity was falsely understood and was put into function with social rapports. By comparison, Eliade. How can man tolerate the catastrophes and horrors of history, from collective deportations and massacres to atomic bombings, if beyond them he can glimpse no sign, no trans-historical meaning? For both Ionescu and Eliade, what is evil is the process of secularization, which is caused by rationalism and historicism. Moreover, secularization represents a direct threat to ecclesia, which is a non-rational spiritual form. What is obscured, of course, in Eliade more than in Ionescu, is the human agency behind secularization. It's not, Eliade disguises his ultra-nationalism by framing the terror of history as bad things that happen. By framing the latter as an inevitable consequence of messianic time, both Ionescu's religious man and Eliade's homo religiosus thus become incompatible with Jews, Protestants, and Marxists on spiritual ontological rather than on racial grounds. Thus the "I'm not a fascist, I'm just living out my religion" argument. I include this slide not as part of a thoroughgoing Marxist critique, but rather to concretize the abstract. Both Eliade and Ionescu were aware that their irrationalist, anti-historicist revelations provided the basis for a holy war against rationalism and historicism. That was the point. The soteriological task in both ideologies is to combat the theodicy. The good guys fight the bad guys. The rationalist, historicist terror of history by bringing about the palingenesis, tip of the hat to Roger Griffin, or rebirth of the ecclesia or nation. Brings us to this soteriological task. Now that we know what evil is, what do we do about it? In theological terms, soteriology refers to, quote, how man is saved, end quote. For both Ionescu and Eliade, soteria, salvation, requires bringing the new vision of the nation, bringing it about, realizing the transcendent model in the mundane time and space. Ionescu's philosophy, referred to as trairism from the verb to live, refers to this process in a manner similar to how Fox and Miller-Idris use talking, choosing, and performing the nation, except that in Ionescu's model, one talks, chooses, performs, and consumes God in order to create the nation. So Ionescu on soteria. The imperialism of a nation is justified insofar as it realizes a new cultural form, a new spiritual form. Through the nationalism of the 20th century is, that's something else from Ionescu that I left myself as a footnote. Right, so Ionescu justifying imperialism as a means of salvation. Eliade, an unknown, foreign, and unoccupied territory, which often means unoccupied by our people, Eliade uncharacteristically admits here, still shares in the fluid and larval modality of chaos. And Eliade's soteriology, recall, is to turn chaos into cosmos, which is also what Jordan Peterson has basically lifted from Eliade. The same thing, we are justified in conquering you because we have to do it to save ourselves. Eliade's abolishing of profane time and space is an abstract presentation of Ionescu's imperialism. To conquer the profane is to create the sacred. And, this brings us to the last comparison. Ecclesia as a nation refers to a temporal manifestation of the transcendent ideal, like a Platonic form. Catholics refer to this as the church on earth. And we're almost done as well. Catholics refer to this as the church on earth, an imperfect projection into time and space of a perfect transcendent reality. The distance between the perfection of the ideal and the imperfection of reality is what drives the repetition of the cycle of palingenetic rebirth and ultra-nationalism, as well as talking, choosing, performing, and consuming the nation in Fox and Miller-Idris. The character of the nation, offensive and imperialist par excellence, is an organism that cannot live besides in expansion, life, and dynamism. And here, unbelievable, it is not about me, the living nation on the offensive, but it's about them, for them to arrange themselves however they can with me. So this is the ecclesia of Ionescu. Now, the ecclesia of Eliade, by comparison, is a bit more subtle in one particular quote, but we have dozens upon dozens. All these beliefs express the same feeling, which is profoundly religious. Our world is holy ground because it is the place nearest to heaven, because from here, our abode, it is possible to reach heaven. Recall that Eliade has already made his case for expansionism. With that, we have lined up point for point revelation, theodicy, soteriology, and ecclesia in the philosophy of religion of Nae Ionescu, and in the theory of religion of Mircea Eliade. The operative elements, by which I mean the parts that do something, relate to one another in the same way. Eliade's theory of religion is, for all intents and purposes, the same as Ionescu's philosophy of religion, which formed an integral part of the Iron Guard's fascist ideology. I'll arrive at my conclusions shortly, but first I wanted to address an important implication of introducing this ecclesiological methodology. Perhaps not surprisingly, the ecclesiological framework that I use to compare Eliade's theory to Ionescu's philosophy promises to have further implications. With time, as I've mentioned, I plan to work my way through the thinkers of the New Right, the North American far-right philosophers, and the North American far-right philosophers. However, my familiarity with the work of Alexander Dugin and Jordan Peterson has allowed me mentally to explore the application of this method to analyses of their work. So I'm not going to go through this except to say with Dugin, he's using Eliade's sacred profane dichotomy and the same language of a soteria, which is to say a salvation of sacralizing time and space. Creating sacred time and space as his nation. And as I've already mentioned, Jordan Peterson with his separation of order and chaos, which is Eliade's cosmos and chaos by any other name. And he even uses, with his elaborate diagrams, he recreates the coincidentia oppositorum, the same misuse of Nicholas of Cusa's coincidentia oppositorum. So, conclusions. Ionescu's philosophy is anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, anti-Marxist, anti-Protestant, anti-Catholic. Eliade's theory neatly maps onto it. Ionescu's misery and Eliade's terror of history obscure the material cause of the misery of or terror of history, which, as I'm sure any Marxist theorists among us can understand immediately, how that would appeal to the materially privileged by foregrounding anti-rational, anti-historical argumentation. Eliade's homo religiosus, thus Eliade's homo religiosus, like Ionescu's Orthodox Romanian, is morally unencumbered by the historicist materialist critique or universal Christian values. So I would say I'm confident of the conviction, but part of what we haven't presented here is the prescriptive nature that I admitted at the beginning of the presentation needed to be abundantly present. What would need to be done to do that is largely a rhetorical analysis of Eliade's arguments. And I can tell you briefly, at the last chapter of his most significant books is always a comparison of the misery of modern man, namely you, dear reader, to the well-adjusted, balanced life of the traditional person, the traditional man. So at the very least, I would say Eliade's theory of religion becomes an ex post facto apologia for Ionescu's philosophy of religion. According to Eliade's theory of religion, or let me put it this way, an Eliadean reading of Ionescu's philosophy of religion would say, yes, A+, that's excellent, traditional, valid religion. There we have it. Implications for the method. Theological, ecclesiological analysis seems to have some benefits, offering ways to compare ideologies, and exposes similarities among Dugin, Evola, de Benoit, and Peterson. So with that, we've reached the end, and we thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for this superb lecture, very rich in material, dedicated to something truly innovative, which I'm very proud that has been hosted and done at home here at CREASE. And I hope that during the discussion you can tell us a little bit more about where the work is going beyond if certain question arises. But I know that you're engaged with your research assistant into translating original Romanian text, which is not very well known or does not appear in English language. Thank you very much for offering us very interesting way forward for me as a political scientist to think about political philosophy and application, specifically with the new right. And Dr. Neuberger, we can open it for questions. I certainly have one with that will necessarily involve Dr. Roberts's sort of answer on how basically what makes the authors that you're discussing such magnets, such rock stars for the radical right and far right. What does that offer them that is so applicable and transcends historical periods, and it goes way forward, to Jordan Peterson? If I can, use the first opportunity to ask this question, Dr. Roberts, before we start lining up a lot of questions in the chat.
Sure. So figures from the new right. You're saying what makes them appealing to
yes, what
readers
makes them
or to other philosophers, or
to people that are involved at organizational of organizing sort of cultural milieus, but also to readers. What makes them so applicable within this larger context of modern far right?
In a word, I would say the possibility of co-belligerence, because I'm going to use an analogy. If some of you will remember Betty Crocker cake mixes, just add eggs and water. So what Eliade manages to accomplish is not Romanian fascism. He doesn't say use Romanian eggs and Romanian water. You can add any eggs and water. You can add any blut and boden and bake your fascist cake. So what it is sort of, it's a map for an ecclesiological argument, and it is a legitimation of an ecclesiological paradigm that is nationalist but not universal. It's an invitation for every nation to be its own fascist
in their particular way, right?
In their particular way. So you have I saw a very offensive meme that was the rainbow LGBTQ flag with "every race has its place" written on the bars of the rainbow. But this is the kind of fascism, ecclesiological fascism, what I'm calling that, at least now provisionally, is an apologia, an argument, a commercial, an infomercial, an invitation for everybody to be fascist in their own little fascist homeland. So it is a way of uniting all of the fascists without getting bogged down in details while we're still fighting the Marxists and the liberal world order, etc. So that's my best answer for that question in the moment.
Well,
I would just add one thing to that. I think this is actually maybe a necessary result of what Dr. Roberts just said, but I think what it also does with this kind of thing, with the Jordan Peterson, the De Benoit, the Mircea Eliade, all these guys, I think what they offer people on a sort of practical, sort of day-to-day basis, they offer a way for people who I would argue already have maybe fascist sympathies, unformed, vague, fascistic, norms, things like that. It offers them a way to be a fascist, essentially, but without the name. No, I'm a traditionalist. I'm not a fascist. Those people those are fools. I study Eliade, and I know about the world historical religious forms, and so it lets them be fascist, but without
without a negative, without a negative
right.
connotation. And I see a lot of actually field of exploration for the further research here, because obviously there is something to be said. I know a little bit about the biography of the author that you were discussing, and the provocative style, the provocation presented from the East in an orthodox approach also adds, I believe, to this attraction which they present for an influence for thinkers and for readers and for followers of far right, essentially. At this point, I will stop because I got all fired up, and I see a lot of very original concepts related to this ecclesiastical fascism concept that Dr. Roberts has been working on. But since we do have a number of questions, if you allow me, Dr. Roberts, Sergio, to allow them, the first one that I see is Ivanov. Dr. Ivanov, please.
Thank you, Dr. Avramov. Okay. Iskren Ivanov, Fulbright Visiting Scholar at Chris. My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation today. I have two questions, respectively, to Dr. Roberts and to Dr. Glăjar. I hope that I pronounce your name correctly.
The only mistake was the doctor part.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, but anyway, okay, fine. So, Dr. Roberts, my question to you is, I can see your approach, your methodology, and your thoughts, insights on fascism, but do you think that there is some place for a kind of fascist god on the top of this pyramid? Because research a lot about concepts, theories, and so on, but where is God in all that? Is there just a Vost, a totalitarian leader, or a fascist god?
So do you mean I'll have to get you to specify whether you're using it metaphorically, which is to say, do we need a strong man on earth, or do we need the belief in a transcendent figure? So
yeah,
are you asking? I would say certainly Ionescu and Eliade argue from an abstract sense of God. Ionescu manages to write 180 pages of his philosophy of religion, and the only citation from the Bible, while he claims to be Orthodox the whole time, is the Golden Rule.
Oh, okay.
So it's very much it becomes an elaborate ontological argument for irrational, anti-historical metaphysics. It's just the functional part of fascist religion is something to believe other than historicist materialist critique.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
okay.
it is this, God is a fount of unreason. That's the necessary function of God in this fascist ecclesiology, I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. And now to Mr. Glăjar. My question to you is, that philosophy is really frightening to some extent. So considering the fact that it's so popular in Russia, do you believe that people who support it, those Russians, are the Nazis of 21st century?
I wouldn't say that anything that I have become familiar with happening in Russia would point towards any sort of like hardcore Nazism or anything like that. I mean, okay. What I would say is that, I'm thinking back to in December of last year, a new Romanian very far right party, AUR, Alianța pentru Unirea Românilor, they won, I think, 10% of the seats in the parliament, which was an absolute shock to the country. And what's curious is that those guys have actual proper party ideologues, and it's the same guys who, and everybody, as a matter of fact, they've got a whole team. It's the same people who would work on Nae Ionescu, and Nikifor Krajnic and all these characters. So that's what scares me. But Dr. Roberts knows much more about Russia than I do, though. So let's see.
Well, I just wanted to prompt Sergio to clarify. Isn't the ideologue or one of the leaders of the AUR, didn't he write a biography on Ionescu?
No, not on Ionescu, but yeah, his name is Sorin Lavric. He's gone through a weird metamorphosis, but perhaps it wasn't a metamorphosis at all. He used to be a pretty well-respected, reputable scholar. He was always front page Humanitas. Dr. Krstoch, I can see you. Yeah, I have my reservations as well, don't worry. But anyway, he went from a, relatively respected guy to now one of the main ideologues of this new Romanian far-right party, and he's a parliamentarian. So yeah, he wrote... The one that I'm familiar by him is he wrote a book on Noica, who was one of Eliade's disciples that I talked about in the slide.
Was it the imbecile Noica, right?
The imbecile Noica, yeah. There was the imbecile Noica and the fat Vulcanescus. Blame Eugen Ionescu and his colorful language.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope that helps. I'm happy to discuss more with you soon, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Ivanov. I suppose after 2 years I'll know about Russia a little bit better than I do.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Raul, would you like to ask your question?
Yep, thank you very much for a very rich and interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I would also maybe add a little comment to Kirill's earlier question about why are these people popular today, and why are they popular transnationally and globally, I would say. And I think pragmatically speaking, the fact they're unknown, they're quite unknown as a fascist movement matters a lot. I'm thinking here of Matthew Heimbach, who visited Romania, converted to Orthodoxy, all in an attempt to prove he's not a neo-Nazi, right? I mean, the guy had first surfaced in American politics as part of the National Socialist movement, which pretty much identifies you as a neo-Nazi. But then through his conversion to Orthodoxy and his love for Codreanu, sort of like refashioned himself into a traditionalist. But bottom line, I mean, we're talking about the Romanian fascist movement unknown to most. A fascist leader who was dead in 1938, has nothing to do with the Second World War, was not involved in the Holocaust, was not involved in war crimes. It's way safer to sort of like make yourself a follower of the Legionary movement and of Codreanu than it is to sort of openly praise Hitler or Mussolini. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, considers Codreanu's book to be top of the list of the global fascist canon, and it's a more or less quotes from memory.
To my legionaries?
Yes, it's been translated into countless languages. I know that last year a Swedish edition basically flew off the shelves. Well, the virtual shelves, it's not sold publicly, it can't be sold publicly. But someone who's working on fascism in Sweden was telling me that the third Swedish edition was basically exhausted in a matter of months. So this is a book that is hugely influential globally, not just in certain contexts. And this is where my questions actually bring to. I mean, this is the focus on Eliade and on Ionescu is interesting and important in and of itself. But my question is, what do you think of the relationship between their political theology and the actual political ideology of the Iron Guard? Because the two are influential sort of separately or in conjunction with the Iron Guard. Do you think there are also significant differences between what I would say is the politics of it? And I would, so on the one hand, to what extent do you think they are popular among fascists because of the fact that they are known as fascists politically? And to what extent do you think it's just the theology, the political philosophy that you spoke about that makes them popular in certain circles and makes them be picked up by people like the Benoit and Dugin and Peters? I didn't know about Peterson, honestly. I knew about the others, but I had no idea that Peterson also draws on the other. Yeah.
Oh, Christina just joined us. She must have gotten the
And my second question, I'm convinced of your association of Nae Ionescu and Eliade, and I can see the similarities for sure. But I would also think there are significant differences. And one of them is that Eliade is way more eclectic in his take on religions and in the plural. And he was highly suspicious of the orthodoxism, which was characteristic of interwar Romanian society. He was very critical of it, actually. And in an article that I have in press, I'm talking about how he becomes political in India and how the period before India is one where he thinks, he talks about intellectuals as these people who have to stay out of politics. We are too, we are too important to get involved in that. That is just below us. It's not something worthwhile for an intellectual. Whereas in India, he gets exposed to British colonialism, hates it. He witnesses the sort of like the anti-colonial movement of Gandhi. And on the basis of that, upon his return to Romania, you see Eliade getting political. And that is very, very different from Nae Ionescu's stance, which was always political and always very Romanian in nature, very much grounded in Romanian realities. Whereas Eliade's, I would argue that both his philosophical outlook and his political positions, I mean, he was a strong supporter of decolonization, for example, which I can't imagine Nae Ionescu ever being. His is much more clearly a European racism, where the Europeans are, in Ionescu's worldview, superior to everyone else. They are a civilization per se. Whereas for Eliade, it's clearly not the case. He's actually critical of the fact that European culture thinks it's so special and so universal and so on. So I would sort of like wonder if you've looked also at the differences between the two in terms of their philosophies.
Yes. Well, let me start with the first question before I'm trying to hang on to it about, if I understood correctly, the popular appeal of Codreanu. You're saying sort of to my legionaries in Swedish, etc.
No, there was just a comment about to Kirill's, in addition to your response to Kirill's question.
Thank you. It was, you addressed something that I asked
but my question was partly related because it was the extent to which
I thought you had two. So
did you have but the first was about the extent to which the philosophy that you've talked about relates to the popularity of the political ideology, which is truly fascist.
Right. Okay. So let me answer that again briefly as best I can, which is to say, I think the elaboration of, well, let me start here. Ionescu's philosophy is not popular, at least not outside of Romanian language. That's the point. We got it. Sergio far better than I, but both of us can speak and read Romanian, and so we had access to this. And the shoe drop of this presentation is that somehow in decades of combing over Eliade's life, trying to figure out, was he a fascist? Does it matter? Nobody read Philosophy of Religion by Nae Ionescu and discerned that Eliade's theory is all but plagiarized. I mean, this is such strong evidence that I think should absolutely be considered in the Eliade debate. So I would say I'm arguing that Ionescu somehow managed to be not popular. He failed, at least ultimately. However, in a modified form, which is what I'm accusing Eliade of doing, to answer your question about the differences between the two, it does become wildly popular. And I suspect it's because Ionescu was arguing for Romanian fascism, and at least in my reading, Eliade is arguing for a fascist world, or at least a world in which people who are fascists are not doing anything wrong. And so that has necessarily broader appeal than a professor at the University of Bucharest who, has his favorite students out to his house with suspicious frequency. So I absolutely take your point. I am inclined to believe that we agree on this, and perhaps it is only a failure of my presentation that it may have seemed otherwise. So hope that answered the question. I would return to your other question, perhaps in lieu of an answer, to say that while I do sometimes play one on Zoom, I am not a Balkanist, and I do intellectual history of theology, which is why it's the mental furniture that I'm familiar with. I am doing my homework and increasingly becoming familiar with interwar Romania and the Iron Guard as a movement. But I would say my suspicion is that there was probably less to do, less of a relationship between this ideology and the Iron Guard. It was there, but less of similarity than there is between Ionescu's ideology and that of Alexander Dugin. I think ideologues fall into the same ruts, and those ruts are the formation argument, are theological arguments, non-rational, anti-historical arguments for the formation of an ecclesia, which is this transcendent Platonic form of nation that must be brought into being in order to save ourselves from non-existence. And I see this over and over again with arguments of Alexander Dugin. It's there with Eliade's Terror of History. It's chaos. I mean, with Jordan Peterson, whether he means to or not, he's recapitulating this argument of, we have to stop these people or it's the end of the world as we know it. It is the theodicy, the nature of evil, and the soteriology, what we have to do to save ourselves, that defines these in part, and that much is just fascist. But the ecclesia, for me, is this new nation, whether that's Dugin's Eurasia, or whether that is, for Ionescu, this notion of basically getting all of the Uniate Catholics in Romania to convert back to Orthodoxy. He was trying to take two identities, because everybody was already ethnically Romanian and a Romanian citizen, but half of them were Catholic. He didn't want that, so he said only half of you are real. And so he's trying to consolidate, fighting against the ecumenism that was coming from the Catholic side, right after the 1925 Concordat from the Pope, saying, basically a tomos, saying you can be Romanian Catholic. So Ionescu's argument is you have to be Orthodox in order to be Romanian. And Dugin's trying to use this in an expansionist sense, saying our ecclesia is bigger than we have claimed. So you all already belong if you would but behave like it. So we can all be one. And I think it can be used, this ecclesiological model, as it always has been with, reformations and schisms. It's a way of redrawing the transcendental map, and thus the physical map.
Jason, I'm really loving your lengthy answers as much as I'm
Sorry.
loving the lengthy questions. And I want to push you on that point this weekend over a glass of wine. But today we're running low on time. So I just want one last quick question, and that's Keith, who has his hand up and has been waiting patiently. So quick question and quick answer, and then we'll be wrapping up Balkan Circle for today.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Jason and Sergio, for this presentation. So my question is in relation to, Jason, what you had up about Ionescu justifying imperialism as a means of salvation. So is this imperialism in the way you were just talking about orthodoxy over Catholicism, or is it Romanian cultural imperialism? I'm just wondering how that idea of imperialism shakes out when Romania is seen as at the crossroads of bigger empires.
I'll try and begin answering this question briefly. So you are very right to point out, Keith, that it is in fact the case that well, perhaps it is the case, or perhaps people think it is the case, but yeah, everyone knows that Romania has been, at the crossroads of many empires and so on and so forth. And that whole element is definitely not, it actually isn't absent in either Ionescu or in Eliade. You can find that sentiment pretty clearly expressed in both. But the kind of, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Roberts. Let's see if you can help me out here. I lost my train of thought. If it comes back, I will. I'll say it at the end.
All right. Thank you for the question, and thank you for being here, Keith. I would say, and perhaps this is the part that Dr. Neuberger wants to press me on. Obviously, I am not drinking the fascist Kool-Aid, right? I am not saying that this transcendent church somehow exists in a real form. I'm saying that it factors into the formation of the mundane form. So it is one of the moving pieces, but it isn't the it is not the map, right? It is not the territory. Well, let me be careful not to misuse existing language. So it only comes into play as a form of ideology when you want to do real, physical, mundane, geographical imperialism, right? It becomes the story that you get straight before you march off to battle. It becomes, it is the new palingenesis, right? It is writing. It is writing the prequel after you've written the novel, so that you have a different ending. And that's what I would say is going on here.
Right.
On the ground, it's to the same ends. It's just the interest for me in this tool, while I'm very excited to use it to compare Eliade to Ionescu, and I hope that people are able to find it of some use on the ground looking at Romanian history. It seems to be the necessary basis for comparison between Evola as a traditionalist and Guénon. On the one hand, between Alain de Benoit, Dominique Venner, and some of the European New Right on the other, Eliade as a so-called soft traditionalist. Jordan Peterson has been compared to Eliade. So far, these are treated as an eclectic far right. And what I'm proposing is there is a possible point-for-point comparison, and we can talk about it in terms of differences in how they generate their initial revelation, how they define their theodicy, how they define their soteriological tasks. It's all the pieces that, in the same way that we're able to compare Catholicism to Lutheranism, which leads to a shoe drop that I'm not necessarily prepared to make yet, but is already implied. Fascism is a religion.
And just to save my shame, the point that I wanted to make very brief, Keith, the idea with imperialism with Ionescu is that he sees it. So he says, I'm paraphrasing here, it wasn't in the presentation, at least not in so many words, but he says, imperialism is justified insofar as you are serving or serving God through it, and B, and this is what I think is really interesting, imperialism is justified insofar as your act of imperialism creates a new spiritual form. And this is a good thing. It is a good thing for Ionescu, make new spiritual forms. So that's the idea. So I guess under that interpretation, the British Raj under the East India Company, for God's sake, was a new spiritual form, I guess. So the evil there is pretty prima facie. But anyway, just wanted to finish my little point there. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm going to wrap this up now with just a few quick last words that Jason can think about before our next conversation, but I won't let him answer right now.
No,
it's just, I'm just opening up broader questions. So one is, how do
you're
these
getting the last word is what you're doing.
I know. Well, okay. Closing the circle. How do these complex ideas filter down to the pop? How do you use complex ideas? How do you sort of cook down complex ideas to simple formulas that you use to bring on followers? So
By
blood and
using
soil.
the ones that people have been using for the last
I
2,000
said you didn't
years.
get an answer.
But it's a simple answer. He's co-opting existing church categories that people already know.
I know, but it's
you
not
got the
just
bear
him, but I
trap.
mean, how do those ideas, you know what I mean? Or how are they used to mobilize people? And then the other one is just this tension between religious ideas that allow for kind of, I guess, rebirth or conversion, or, you know, kind of a finding, you know, what you're talking about, even expansive sort of expansion of the ecclesia, the tension between that and racial fascism, which specifically excludes certain people based on heritable characteristics. So that's something that, you know what I mean? Like, you're a Jew, there's no way you can't, even through conversion, it doesn't matter. You're
Right.
lost.
Well,
So anyway,
for Ionescu, it's you're already.
wait a minute, remember I said you don't get an answer. Oh, all right, go ahead, quick.
Well, it's simple. For Ionescu thus far, his problem is not that he wants to let Jews become Romanians. It's that he has some people who think they're Romanians, but can't be because they're Catholic. So it's a matter of forcing participation on a level even in addition to race, in addition to state. So it's and this is the true religion heretic dichotomy that already exists within the theological discourse. But you're absolutely right to say I have to do a better and better job clarifying this point, and I need historical examples. So I'm calling on Balkanists, actual Balkanists, and historians.
Oh, we can have a long conversation about this. So. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Jason didn't let me have my last word, so.
Dr. Neuberger, before you go.
Oh yeah, for everyone still here, next week is our last week of Balkan Circle, and actually I'm going to be presenting a book chapter from my book, which is in press at Cornell. It's a food history, and my chapter's on bread in Bulgarian history. So looking forward to that and hope to see many of you there.
Thank you very much today for active participation, and we're looking forward for such an audience to be such engaged for our last meeting when Professor Neuberger will close the circle for this academic year. And again, thank you both in the US, outside, for your participation and support. We really, truly value your inputs and as parts of our circle. Thank you very much.
Christina.